And it is really through perseverance and remarkable diplomacy that the Jews are able to pick themselves up and to get recognition for a much truncated and smaller Jewish state in the lands that were previously supposed to be all for a Jewish state, but now there's just not enough Jews. As the British are responding to Arab violence, they're thinking, okay, we will, and they want to placate the Arabs. That's the most important thing for the British in the 30s. And they think, okay, we'll give the Arabs a state and we'll give the Jews a teeny weeny, essentially city-state around Tel Aviv, basically. They want to give them pretty much Tel Aviv as a state. The Arabs reject that too. This is the Peale Commission. That's part of the response to the Arab violence, to the Arab revolt.
So this is the 1930s.
This is 1937. And basically they say, okay, the vast majority of this land between the river and the sea that was supposed to be for the Jews, we already created Transjordan, which is 80% of the land. That was taken away from the mandate for Palestine. And the rest was supposed to be Jewish. And it's important to mention when the British tore off 80% of the mandate area to give it to Transjordan, that's the moment when Jews were no longer allowed in that land. So it was understood that west of the Jordan River is for the Jewish state. And again, because of Arab violence, there were just not enough Jews in time. But the Arabs reject it because they say not even the size of a post stamp. They've made it very clear that any Jewish state in any borders is illegitimate because that goes back to the fundamental issue. A Jewish state means sovereign, upright Jews who defend themselves by themselves, and that's unacceptable. Ernst Bevin, if you know anything about him, he did not like
not
Jews.
Friendly to the Jews.
Not
friendly, yeah. Not a fan.
Not a fan. And he goes to the British Parliament in February 47 to explain why Britain betrayed the mandate. And this is, by the way, this is why the mandate goes back to the United Nations, which is the heir of the League of Nations. And he has to explain why Britain fulfilled its mandate to the Arabs through Iraq and Transjordan, but not to the Jews. And he says the following: His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. This is February 47. There's no settlements, there's no occupation, there's no refugees, there's no state of Israel yet. And already he calls it irreconcilable. And he says, look, in this land, between the river and the sea, there are two groups, Jews and Arabs. So there's no question that those are the two collectives. And he says each one of them has a top priority. The one thing they care about more than anything, he calls it the point of principle. And he says for the Jews, the point of principle is to establish a state. So the Jews want a state. He says for the Arabs, the point of principle is to prevent to the last the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land. He's not saying the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state, and we'd love the UN's help in drawing the border. He says as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. First, they want to make sure that the Jews don't have a state, then everything else.
Okay.
And as a result, this has been the best predictor of the behavior of both sides since that moment. Because the Jews want a state, so they always make decisions that work in order to get a state. And the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. And as we'll discuss, we'll see that all their decisions are very consistent with that top priority.
British are saying to the UN, you're in charge. You're going to be in charge.
Exactly. You know, we were the temporary carriers of this mandate. Take it back. We were not able to fulfill it, and you take it back. So the United Nations creates a whole committee, and ultimately they say, at the end of the day, the best thing is just to divide this land. And they create a partition plan for a Jewish state and an Arab state. The territory assigned to the Jewish state, it's one of my favorite things to look at, is essentially the Negev Desert, plus the lands that the Jews reclaimed for malaria in the early 20th century. And the Arabs, true to their top priority, go to war. Because the Jews celebrate in the streets, right? We all have those images of the Jews listening to the radio, Australia, yes, right? And
Meaning
then
the vote in the UN.
the vote in the United
Yeah,
Nations
yeah.
on partition, and it's a very iconic moment for every Israeli growing up. The Jews in Israel huddled by the radio, waiting for the outcome of the vote. And when 2/3 of the General Assembly approve partition, they go dancing in the streets, even though it's a truncated state, and they don't get Judea, which is the cradle of Judaism, and they don't get Zion, Jerusalem, which is where Zionism comes from. But even this truncated state is still a source of jubilation because it fulfills the top priority of the Jews of sovereignty, of a state, however small, whatever territory, as long as we can be sovereign. So now we have a few months before the end of the British Mandate, which ends on May between 14 and 15 at midnight.
But the UN has already voted on partition.
But the UN has already voted
Voted for partition.
for partition, and now erupts essentially a civil war or a war between the Jews and the Arabs in the Mandate area as the British are winding down. But at this point, it's still a local war between the Jews and Arabs. And it's important to know, until March 1948, the Jews are losing. They essentially take a defensive position. They're trying to protect the places where Jews live, and they're losing. And because they're losing, the British and the Americans are in conversation around March 1948 to renew the mandate. They're basically saying, okay, this is not going to work out well. Let's renew the mandate. Ben-Gurion, the head of the Yishuv, the pre-state years, understands that if the Jews will not be able to sustain themselves militarily, they're not going to get their state. And they go on the offensive in April 1948, and essentially in time for the British leaving, they're able to secure some of the territory for the Jewish state. Then the British leave.
Mm-hmm.
And when the British leave, Israel declares independence, and now several Arab countries join the Arabs, the local Arabs, in an onslaught on the newly declared Jewish state with the exact same goal. I mean,
Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria,
some
Iraq.
Iraqi forces.
Right.
Exactly.
So they all
Exactly.
go in on May 14th, 1948.
Yeah, beginning in May 15th,
Yeah.
the next day, yes.
Yeah.
And yes. And they are very clear about the fact that they are there to ensure that the Jewish state does not emerge and does not survive the onslaught. In the 20th century transition from empires to nation states, or states if they're not lucky, new borders are delineated. In the process of new borders being delineated, it's almost always a very bloody, violent process, and you have tens of millions of refugees being created as people flee across these newly created borders, typically to the side that is more ethnically similar to them. You have this happening across Europe with the Germans and Poles and Ukrainians and Bulgarians and Italians and, of course, Turks and Greeks and Hindus and Muslims. And this is happening here, too. Already in November, December 1947, before the Arab onslaught, before the British leave, the top, the most educated, the wealthiest of the Arabs in the land leave. This was devastating for the local Arabs because essentially the entire leadership, the entire educated class left within the first few weeks of the civil war situation between the Jews and Arabs. Then, with the Jewish offensive that begins in April 48, as I said, this is the moment that the Jews understand that they either win or there's no state. Then begins the process of also some expulsions and people essentially also being pushed out. None of them, and that's important to mention, are what you call today ethnic cleansing. And this is why it's so important, and we included in the book, especially in English, descriptions of what the war was like. Brutal, existential, door to door, and with a clear declaration by the Arabs that they have no intention to allow the Jews to remain sovereign for a single moment, if they can help it. The notion is that Israel can no longer be on the defensive. It needs to go out. And because this is essentially a civil war where the fighters are part of the population, there's no difference. In places where the Arab population said, you know, we're good with the Jewish state, we're not fighting, those are places that nobody was hurt. You see it in Abu Ghosh today. But in places where there was fighting,
So Abu Ghosh is just outside of Jerusalem.
Yes.
And it's an Arab town.
yeah,
And it's a very healthy civil relationship.
exactly, and there was no fighting. So
And the Arab community has very close relations with the
Exactly.
Jewish communities that surround it. Yeah.
exactly, ethnic cleansing is essentially when you do it to people who are. It's not in war. It's not in fighting. You do it because of their ethnicity, not because they're fighting. When people are expelled, it's because of a fighting war situation. And it's important to remember this is incredibly normal in the course of war. Certainly this kind of like existential door-to-door, village-to-village war, which was the Jewish-Arab war between November 29th, 47 and until the Arab onslaught in May 15th.